Welcome. So today we are lucky to have Leon Rodriguez, the Director of the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, to talk. My name is Margaret Weir. I am a professor here at Brown in political science and at Watson. So let me tell you about the format for today's program, and then I will introduce Director Rodriguez. So what we will do, Director Rodriguez will talk for about 15 or 20 minutes, and then I will pose questions for about 15 or 20 minutes. And that will leave us about 45 minutes to open it to the floor for any discussion that we want to have. So it's a real pleasure to welcome Leon Rodriguez back to Brown. He graduated from Brown in 1984. He was confirmed by the Senate in June of 2014 and sworn in July of 2014 as the Director of the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. He was previously Director of the Office of Civil Rights at the Department of Health and Human Services. And he served as Chief of Staff and Deputy Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights in the Department of Justice before that. Prior to that, he was County Attorney for Montgomery County, Maryland, county that I have lived in, and served in U.S. Attorney's Office for the Western District of Pennsylvania from 1997 to 2001, first as Chief of White Collar Crime Section, and then as the first Assistant U.S. Attorney. Rodriguez is the son of immigrants who came from Cuba in 1961 and was raised speaking Spanish at home. So I'm very pleased to welcome Director Rodriguez, and let's welcome him back to Brown.
So I am actually, if it's okay with the group, I'm going to go unplugged for my portion. Can everybody hear me? So what I'd like to do is actually tell you a little bit about my personal story. So I want to tell you a little bit about my family's personal story. Second, to talking a little bit about what I see as sort of the critical immigration issues of right now. And then talk about a couple of specific initiatives of this administration really to promote what in our mind is a more just and more welcoming immigration system. So you heard that there we go, it's working. You heard that my parents came from Cuba. Actually, my grandparents were Jews from Turkey and from Poland, who in the 20s and 30s emigrated partly here to the United States, although ultimately that part of the family also went to Cuba, and then also went directly to Cuba. My maternal grandfather, who was born in Turkey, was a volunteer with Jewish organizations in Cuba. And during World War II, some of you have probably heard the story of the St. Louis, but that was not the only one. There would be groups of Jews that would be coming from Europe that needed to be absorbed, and he as a volunteer assisted them in finding housing, finding work, acclimating themselves to Cuban society. After Fidel Castro came to power, and in that particularly unsettled time, immediately after the Cuban Revolution, he actually again became a volunteer for something called the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, and assisted families that were seeking to apply to come to the United States. At the same time that was happening, my parents actually, just before they got married, my father was detained, ostensibly on suspicion that he had planted a bomb in a government warehouse. My maternal grandfather was arrested multiple times. The one I just told you was a volunteer, for no reason at all, actually just for questioning, and the detentions could be a few hours here, they could be a few days there. In one case, they were a couple of weeks. as was his brother-in-law, my maternal great-uncle, who often was taken in the same dragnet. And so the time came that my parents came here to the United States. My grandmother and grandfather actually had permission to come to the United States. However, this great-uncle I just mentioned did not. My grandmother refused to come to the U.S. And the reason that she refused was that she worried that, and I just learned this, by the way, in the course of doing the job that I'm doing now, she worried that if she left him alone there, that he in fact would be arrested, and this time without anybody to go and advocate for him and to support him, that in fact the key would be thrown away, in essence, and that he would be stuck. And so she waited. My grandfather became ill. He died. I never met him. My mother had not seen him in 3 years before he passed away. Eventually, my grandmother and great-uncle made it here to the U.S., as did the rest of my extended family. This story is a story that I think about pretty much every single day that I do the job that I am doing now. And in particular, I think about the grandfather I never met and the service that he gave. And I think about it in two ways. One, to emulate his example, but two, because it underscores, for me, that any given immigration case, and I think those of you who are familiar with immigration know that immigration can range from a refugee, it can be an undocumented person, it could be somebody who comes here because they married somebody or they're here to join a family member, or, as is very common here at Brown, somebody who comes here for work and who has an employment-based reason to be here. That said, every single case, in my mind, and evidence has sort of corroborated this for me, is the story of some family's hopes and dreams, and in a lot of cases, the story of its sufferings in another place, regardless of where that person is in the continuum and spectrum of what's going on with immigration. We've obviously had some pretty heated debates about immigration policy. They've been happening since I was a teenager. From my perspective, I'm not sure that any of the subjects we talk about are necessarily new. I'm also one of those who believes, however, that there actually is a fairly definitive core of American opinion about immigration, including about undocumented immigration. And that very often the issue gets inflamed for purely political reasons, beyond what people actually feel about that issue. And I think this is true when we talk about undocumented, it's true when we talk about refugees. One of the reasons, additional reasons, why I love the subject of immigration is because it really implicates everything. Every aspect of public policy feeds into the decisions we make in immigration. So they are about what we want our country to be politically, what we think about our economy, what we think of ourselves in terms of humanitarian values. All of that feeds into the decisions that we make about immigration. So I think there's a few big questions, and they certainly feed into this conversation about immigration reform. The first is, do we have an immigration system that actually reflects our economy? It reflects our needs as an economy. And I think if you were to talk to many, many CEOs, they would tell you that the answer is absolutely not. That in fact it is far too difficult to attract and then retain talent, meaning there are people who come here, go to Brown on a visa, and then have to go back and don't end up being able to work in the U.S. because we have an immigration system that says ultimately that they can't. And there are many CEOs who will tell you that that is dysfunctional, that's broken. And the basic platforms for that system are systems that in fact were created decades ago, back in the 1960s at the time that my grandparents came. The second question, though, relates to the reality of the pushes and pulls of who comes to the U.S., whether it is for work or whether it is for family reasons. And I personally believe that there is no issue that is kept at bay purely through immigration restriction. So in other words, if we say we don't want a particular group to come because we're worried about terrorism, we don't want a particular group to come because we're worried about economic competition, those issues will show themselves some other way. They will not show necessarily as an immigration issue, but they'll show up as another national security issue. They'll show up as civil disturbance in another country that we end up having to deal for that reason. So those problems are never necessarily kept at bay. So as a result, I think there are many who believe, as I do, as the President believes, that in fact our historic approach toward the undocumented is wrong-headed. Because it doesn't recognize the reality that, in fact, literally millions of undocumented people are, in fact, here to stay. And in fact, there is nothing that we can do or have the resources to do to cause not only those 11 million people, but the 19 million other people who are parts of their families to return to the countries from which many of those individuals came, who, by the way, in most cases have been here for 5 and 10 and 15 years, 20 years. The reality is, in fact, that the number of undocumented people in the U.S. is actually declining. And it is declining in particular because of the growing strength of the Mexican economy. And that's a story that's not often told here in the United States because people prefer to talk about, the media certainly prefers to talk about narcotics trafficking and particular parts of Mexico that are in fact violent and troubled. But the true story of Mexico is actually a story of economic success. And that's really one of the primary reasons why immigration has declined. So recognizing those realities, there are two critical initiatives that I wanted to talk about. The first is the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program. And I think probably a lot of you are familiar now with what that is. That is basically a program that defers deportation for people between the ages of 16 to 31, subject to some other requirements that we won't necessarily dig into right now, who came here as children, who came here before the age of 16. In many cases, I've met many of these young people. They no longer actually speak the language of the country that they came from. And they certainly have been educated in our schools, are pursuing work in our schools. And so what we have said is we're going to not only defer deportation, but we're going to let you work. We're going to give you work authorization, subject to certain conditions. And there's roughly now about 750,000 young people who have taken advantage of this program. I know that there are some who go here to Brown who are part of this program. It has been a stunning success story in the sense that many of these young people have, in fact, done everything that you guys are doing. Going to school, pursuing professions, pursuing career. And I think in particular it's actually critical when we talk about this that we talk not just about the ones who end up at Brown, but the ones who are also then able to go to Montgomery College in the county where I live and able to get an HVAC license where that wasn't an option before. And now they have a way for above-board gainful employment for themselves and for their families. And important to underscore that they are typically part of mixed-status families, which means that there are often children who are actually American citizens, were born here in the U.S., or siblings, or parents, or the whole gamut. These families tend to have different immigration statuses. As I think everybody knows, we attempted to expand that program to include parents of U.S. citizens and legal permanent residents. That was enjoined by the Supreme Court, as was a further expansion of that program. We are now in the third cycle of renewal. So this program was started in 2012. there are now people who are entering their third cycle of requesting deferred action treatment. This all puts off a day of reckoning for what is going to happen for those young people, but as well the other 11 million undocumented who are in the U.S. We do not have the resources to send them home. If that is what anybody ever wanted to do, the fact is that we do not have the resources to do it. And so sooner or later, we will need to find some sort of reasonable, durable solution for the circumstances of those people. The other issue you've probably heard a lot of discussion about is the issue of refugees, and in particular refugees from parts of the Middle East, and in particular Syria. The fact is that it is a long tradition of this country to welcome refugees from all over. There have been big waves back in World War II. Obviously, people were welcomed from Europe. Incidentally, many of the same concerns that are being raised about Syrians today were raised about European immigrants back in World War II. There was another round of Iron Curtain refugees, including my parents, who came here in the 1960s, and the same concerns were raised about them back in the 1960s. And so similar concerns are now being raised about this group of refugees. And whenever we get into this conversation, one thing that I point out is the following, it seems to me, incredibly troubling fact. If you look at Turkey and Jordan, where the largest masses of Syrian families in exile now live, 700,000 children are not going to school, and in many cases have no immediate prospect of going to school. What that potentially means for the future is devastating, because you have young people who will have, as a result, more difficulty in getting employment. Think about what it means. All of you, obviously, if you're here, you went through schooling, what it'll mean if you lose 2, 3, or 4 years of schooling. We'll have more difficulty getting employment. That affects them and their families. They will be more vulnerable to recruitment for human trafficking, recruitment for terrorism, and recruitment for other organized criminal activity, unless there is a way of normalizing their circumstances. So that is why when people talk, from my perspective, about refugee admission as a purely humanitarian undertaking, it is my view that they're missing the point. It is absolutely humanitarian. We need to do it for that reason, but it is also absolutely critical. It is a responsibility that we have along with our partner countries, because it's also a national security imperative. Because unless we resolve this mass displacement in some way, this will become a worsening problem, really for the entire globe, including the United States. So I think that takes me about to the end of my 15 minutes. I have a feeling we're going to have a really interesting, lively discussion. And Professor Weir, turn over. No, I'm now going to come and sit down, if it's okay with you.
Okay. Well, the agency that Director Rodriguez is in charge of, its real responsibilities are, one of its chief goals are immigrant integration and promotion of citizenship. And as I understand a lot of the way that your work is done, it's with, you don't have a lot of people on the ground. You do a lot of your work with nonprofit organizations and local governments. And so one of the questions that I have, and this is related to my own research, is what about those areas of the country that are very anti-immigrant and that may have very few partners for you to work with on the ground? And so my question is sort of, is there a lumpiness to the work that you're able to do, and how could you begin to be more effective in all parts of the country?
Yeah, no, so I think your basic point is correct. In other words, to the extent that a priority of this administration has been the promotion of immigrant integration, which includes choosing U.S. citizenship, but also includes linguistic integration, economic integration, a big question, and that's something that we are absolutely incapable of doing ourselves, that we need both local government partners, state government partners, actually all three of, and NGO partners, those infrastructures are absolutely far better developed in places like Los Angeles and New York than they might be in other parts of the country where the immigrant populations are not necessarily as developed. And I'm not sure the infrastructure to serve those populations is not necessarily as developed. And corresponding to that is the fact that immigrants are now truly everywhere. And so, you know, if you sort of look around state by state, you just look at our DACA statistics, actually, it's fascinating. Because you'll see clusters in places you absolutely have never heard of. And so, you know, it demonstrates that the traditional model of immigrant populations being concentrated in big cities is absolutely no longer the way things are. I'm not sure I have a 100% complete answer. You and I were talking about this earlier. One of the very interesting models that I've seen is larger cities taking responsibility for supporting the work of immigration in their suburban and exurban areas. That is particularly effective in those counties in suburban towns where you really do have a large enough and sufficiently politically visible immigrant population that is in the interest of that local government to actually pursue that kind of integration. There are places where that model is working. I think right now, the very dissatisfying answer that I have otherwise is that in places where that kind of mechanism doesn't exist, I think we still have an evolution that's going to take some time, but I think it will happen because history has shown that it does happen, that the sort of immigrant-serving infrastructure that's necessary to get the outcomes that you're talking about, that will develop over time.
I've read some cases of public libraries kind of serving as these hubs, both for grants that they get from your
Right.
office, as well as English language and citizenship classes. That might be a place in places that are other politically less willing to work at integrating immigrants.
No, absolutely, and that is something that has happened, and we actually have a whole sort of kit that they can basically take and put in the library, and it is, you know, good advantages taken of those resources.
So let me ask another question. Now, your agency is in charge of DACA. It's in charge of the immigrant integration, promotion of citizenship. There's another whole side to immigration policy, and of course the president, who has promoted much more inclusive laws and has promoted by executive order inclusion, has also been called the deporter-in-chief. 2 million people deported in the first years of his administration. They terminated the program Secure Communities, which on the ground was widely criticized. A lot of local governments didn't want to cooperate with it because it was imprisoning people for no crimes. It was imprisoning citizens. And I gather there's a new program that I know less about called Priority Enforcement Program. But I was looking at some studies, and one study showed that the patterns of how vigorous deportation is not related to crime. It's related to how conservative the voters are in different jurisdictions. So, you know, all of this activity must have a terribly negative impact on the goals of your agency. So why has the Obama administration, which, you know, seems pro-immigrant in many ways, allowed this to happen? Why can't it stop this?
I mean, I think what it's trying to do is I wouldn't say stop it. I think is probably the wrong word. It's trying to regulate it to accomplish its defined policy goal, which is, as I think you've observed, actually to focus removal resources on criminals, threats to national security, recent illegal border crossers. That is a process that has been an evolutionary process to shift away from the old sort of wholesale deportation model to one that is more strategic. I think that some of the priority enforcement program that is meant to partner with local municipal governments in order to work with them to focus their cooperation with removal authorities. By the way, I am not a removal authority. Is meant to focus those energies on felons, on particularly dangerous people. I think that's still they'll have to speak for themselves, but I think it's evolved to a certain point. I think there's still more work to be done to achieve the full penetration of that effort.
But how would you say that that kind of enforcement affects what your activities?
I should address. I think to some degree, some of the programs that we do, like DACA, I think we do have an ongoing challenge, and this is also, by the way, there's an element of the political cycles that causes some anxiety about this as well, is providing people a sufficient level of reassurance that if they come forward in a program like DACA, that in fact they will be safe, that this will be honored by subsequent administrations, that this will not amount to themselves sort of exposing themselves for removal.
And their families will be safe?
It's certainly under our policies. Again, a lot of this also goes to one of the points I was talking about in my remarks, is that there just are not the resources to remove more people than we've been removing so far. So there's not really the kind of resources to be removing millions of people. About 400,000 is about the cap of what we can do annually.
So, this election is going to end soon, something I think we will all be happy about. But the rhetoric about immigrants has been so vicious. And so I wonder, what do you think your agency in a different administration, how can we nudge our discussion about immigration into some more kind of constructive language? Or, what kind of harm do you think has been done to kind of work that you've been trying to do as a result of this election that we've been having?
I think there is a theme that needs to be amplified even more than it has, and it's called the 3 B's: Bibles, badges, and business. And those are, and what's important about those is that those are all cross-partisan. They're not distinct to one party or the other. And there is in those communities, there is some level of consensus, and this is the point that I was making before. One, that whatever solution we find, for example, to the issue of undocumented people, needs to be a humane solution, and importantly, can't be one that blows up our economy. And so, one of the things, now we have 750,000 DACA recipients working, many of them on the books in our economy. Ripping them all out of it is it's hard to fathom what that would mean, particularly in those economies where they are now a large, significant part of the labor force. So I think emphasizing those very, again, sort of cross-partisan aspects of the consensus, I think we need to keep building on that in the future in order to have a more sane, a less heated rhetoric on these issues.
So refugee settlement is one of the things that you do. Do you think that we are settling refugees in the right places? I sometimes hear news accounts of refugees in very inhospitable places and having to deal with all kinds of challenges that they might not in other places. How are decisions, can you talk a little bit about how the decisions of where to locate refugees are, and how well are we doing, would you say, in settling refugees and really making them part of this country? I don't know, I guess I think about the Somalis in Minnesota and some of their kids then going to join ISIS, and I just wonder how well are we doing here?
I think we have there's a basic legal model and it's important, I think, to understand that model. Then we understand to answer the question of how well we're doing, which is basically we provide a decently extensive suite of services to refugees who come as refugees, by the way. It doesn't apply to asylees. It doesn't apply to other categories of entrants. It applies to refugees in their first 8 months
And
in the United
large
States.
is that group per year?
So this past year, we accepted just short of 85,000 refugees. That was the biggest year in a long time. Before that, it was about 70,000 a year. So, you know, with the denominator of the 300+ million people in the United States, it's not actually a very large number. But the way in which we serve those people is through a network of agreements that we have with a combination of state governments and NGOs, very often faith-based NGOs. So a lot of where people go depends on the capacity and the interest in serving those. So I think one of the things that maybe people observe very publicly is that Texas, which was actually one of the largest resettlement states, kind of counterintuitive given kind of a lot of the political heat, but Texas has pulled out and will no longer accept refugee resettlement funds in this fiscal year, even though a place like Houston is actually an extremely welcoming place to new immigrants from all over the place. But that sets I think it's that framework. And then, by the way, after the 8 months, you're off the cliff, meaning you are at that point on your own. Very often, you won't be eligible for social safety net programs at that program, and so you're at a point where you often need to figure it out on your own, unless you have a community or a family or something that will sort of support you in that part of the process. We're not necessarily different than other countries in that respect. But that is why people end up in particular places. Some of those places are extremely hospitable. Other places, if you observe, there's certainly at least a little bit of some negative energy.
Do you think that that's adequate support for refugee resettlement?
I'm not sure that I can give you an authoritative opinion on it, other than I think there's a general thought that it's a tough system in the sense that then you're on your own and you need to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and some will argue that that's great and it's the American way, and some will argue that it's not enough. But I can't say that I feel authoritative on that point.
Let me throw you a softball. If your agency's budget were doubled, how would you use your money?
Ah, wow. So first of all, just so that everybody understands, my budget is a fee-based budget. How we are funded is the fees that we collect from immigrants who are applying for different benefits, excluding certain key categories. Refugee processing, we do not charge. Asylum applications, we do not charge. And we also, many citizenship applications are subsidized if people are in certain poverty tiers. So that work is subsidized by the other fee-paying customers. So if I could double my budget without charging more to our customers, then what I would do is make everything cheaper for the applicants we have already. I would do a whole lot more in terms of grant making, in terms of citizenship promotion, in terms of customer assistance tools. I think those are. I mean, that's Christmas morning. I mean, if we had that kind of situation, there's a lot of neat things that we could do if we were to have that situation.
Okay. Well, let me open up the conversation to any questions in the audience and see how we can continue the conversation.
Yep. Or
You
sorry.
want to go? Yeah.
Okay. Sir.
My name is Alessio. I'm a grad student here, and I've been doing a lot of research this semester on the Syrian refugee crisis, and particularly the U.S.'s policy towards it and how the actual mechanisms work. So I was wondering on your thoughts, which is really what your thoughts are on the system itself, opposed to the actual output and the numbers that we admit, but just the mechanics themselves. Because when you look at the mechanics, there are maybe 6 or 7 giant organizations that are involved, particularly even here in the U.S. You have the State Department, DOD, DOJ, DOHS, you know, TSA on the back end, customs. So to me, you know, in looking through this, I feel like there's rooms for increased efficiency, because I think there's maybe perhaps spaces where there's doubling of efforts. And the duration of time that this process takes is incredibly long. And I think for the people themselves that are, you know, in these locations, I think expediting that is, you know, I think both prudent and also, I think, just. So are there thoughts, or do you have any ideas for making that a better and more efficient process?
So there are more than thoughts, for the very simple reason that the goal that the president has now set for this fiscal year is another 25,000 over the 85,000 that we admitted. So we needed to find a number of efficiencies to get to the 85,000. We will need to find even more efficiencies to get there. That doesn't change the heart of your question, which is the fundamental structure is a multi-agency structure with the State Department, the United Nations Commissioner for Human Rights, the law enforcement and intelligence agencies that support our work. That basic structure will continue to exist. One of the key, you know, you'll hear a lot of people talk about 18 to 24 months as sort of being the typical time. That is an average without meaning, because there's a lot of variance depending on where you are and who you are and where you'll fit in that continuum. You know, the actual amount of time spent working on a case is not 18 to 24 years. It's a tiny fraction of that. One of the things that is time-consuming, and rightfully time-consuming, is the background checking work that we do. Most people obviously are, you know, they're fine and there's no issues with their background check and they move forward in the process. If there's a hit, that can actually cause that individual, well, and at the end the hit might be cleared, by the way. It may turn out that there's actually, it was either not about that person or it's not as bad as it looks or whatever. That can actually cause a case to take a long time. But there is, I agree with the basic premise that there is a lot more room to do a lot better. Part of that is a resource challenge, and part of that is working better within the structure. One of the really happy things in terms of your question, not about the situation itself, is that the president's demand on us, which terrified us in the beginning, there were a lot of people who thought we couldn't do it, was that it really made that entire community of players pull much closer together and communicate a lot more effectively, because we realized if we didn't do that, we weren't going to meet the president's goal. Yeah.
So my question has like 3 points that I'd like you to address. Deportations, resources, and backlogs. So you speak about how so conceivably there aren't enough resources, right, to deport all undocumented immigrants. And yet this administration has increased the number of deportations from the past administrations. And so this narrative about we're deporting criminals and people who shouldn't be here, I think contributes to the negative connotations associated with immigrants in this country. And so in thinking about your resources, I didn't know that your office was fee-based, and so that kind of has a connotation of a business almost, that you should be providing a service, and yet you have these complications of backlog. So the number of people who haven't been able to naturalize in time for the election, that people who submitted their applications in January weren't able to get their naturalization process done in time to vote November 8th. Or the backlogs that are seen in family reunification. So the number of citizens who have petitioned for their family members to be able to, formalize their status or bring into family members from their home country are also years behind. And so I wanted to see if you could address.
Sure. So again, I'm not in the deportation business, in the enforcement business, so I can't totally speak to their resource choices. I can speak to ours. First of all, there is a commitment that we make to a target processing time for citizenship applications of between 5 and 7 months. That is something that we were meeting right up until the last couple of weeks. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't going to be outliers. So you'll always be able to, for a variety of reasons, you will always be able to find a case that took longer. You'll also be able to find many cases that occurred a lot more quickly. than that. But in terms, and you're right, in a sense we run a business. We certainly run a high volume operation. We have to pay salaries. We have to pay rent to where our people where our people work, and we also need to offer a price for the things that we do that is a price that people can actually pay. So that means that you're always striking the balance between what is a price that people will tolerate, and what is all the money you could possibly have to run the most absolutely gold quality service that you could. The other thing is there are large parts of what we do that are paid, that we don't get any funding for, that we don't get paid for them, we don't get congressional funding. That's the refugee work, that's the asylum work, that's the work for people who are getting their fees waived. All of that puts pressure on the system, and so at times that can cause backlogs. What we do is we are in a constant effort to eliminate those backlogs, to reallocate personnel, to get them to work more efficiently in order to eliminate those backlogs. One thing we just did is we raised our fees for the first time in 6 years, and part of that was really in order to be able to raise more money in order to be able to deploy more staff, hire more staff, in order to really do something about these backlogs, which do exist. There's no denying that they exist.
Yeah, I think it was more like the logic behind you functioning off of fees. Like there was a lot of
That's
contribution.
a congressional decision. That's the decision they made.
And so, have there been any attempts at reforming that or like changing that structure?
Not in a very, very long time that I'm aware of.
When was that put into place?
I don't even know. I don't know if, Dennis, do you happen to know? I don't know.
I don't.
Yeah, I mean, how long have you been in the agency?
38 years.
And is that the way it's been for 38
No.
years? Oh.
So maybe it was put in 94, 95?
I would guess the late 80s.
Yeah.
It was the early 2000s, because when I came on board in 96, it was $95. It was a straight fee, it wasn't a fee for service, we were getting funding from the general fund.
I'm not
So
sure.
it sounds like
I
it's
think
been
it's a
around
fair-
since the 80s.
I was overseas for 10 years. It occurred when I was out of the
Yeah.
country.
Well,
But to your basic point, I think it's a fair point for public debate. I will tell you that there has not been, in the community that advocates on our issues, that is not an area where I've seen a big groundswell of advocacy to say we should change from a fee-based to a tax-based structure. But I think it's an interesting topic, public policy topic.
Did anybody speak to the logic behind why it would be a fee-based? Like, it just seems like
Well, because it's a service. I mean, it's the same as if when you go get your driver's license, you pay a fee for your driver's license, or some kind of business. I mean, there's all kinds of services that you get from government that you pay for. And so this is another service that you're getting from government that you're being asked to pay for.
it's the logic of government as a provider of services and citizens and would-be citizens as customers. I mean, it's part of that move to think of government as providing a product, which is about 20 or 25 years old. But can you just say a word about the subsidies that you provide? Because that's sort of probably where it's trusted.
Yeah, let me be a little
as
more
part of this.
detailed about what that means. So for individual or an individual where either that individual or the family unit in which that individual lives, if that family is between 0 and 150% of poverty, the federal poverty guidelines, then the entire naturalization fee is waived. We just issued a rule which will become effective in December that will waive that fee where the family's income is between, will waive half of that fee, I'm sorry, where the family's income is between 151% and 200% of poverty. That was, to the point about advocacy, that was a huge point of advocacy in the immigrant advocacy community, was that waiver be created. Their advocacy succeeded, and the administration adopted that waiver. So those are in terms of sort of, ordinary immigration categories, the key subsidized areas. The other areas that are fully funded by the fees that other immigrants pay are the refugee and asylum work. The asylum work has been expanding massively because of all of the activity that you're hearing about on the border. A very large majority of those cases result in an asylum claim that then we need to process and that needs to go through the immigration courts and the whole process.
Just one point, immigration examinations fee account was enacted in 1988.
88.
Yeah.
Hi, you kind of started touching on this at the end in terms of like the new cases that are being considered or being claimed as seeking asylum. And I was just curious if, in terms of connecting, that you mentioned the reality of immigration, right, especially undocumented immigration, and you also spoke about the new refugee practice that you're having to do. And in order like to reevaluate what it means to be a refugee in terms of like conditions that are happening in your own backyard, what does that mean in terms of reevaluating who gets to be a refugee and who gets?
That's a great question, and it's a great question because I think the traditional understanding of who is a refugee is the classic Soviet era. I live in a country with a very obviously repressive government. They put people in jail. They put me in jail. Most of the things these days that are really putting people in danger are related to or at least in part, to non-state activities, meaning they are in places that have high levels of radicalized violence, high levels of gang activity, high levels of poverty, and that those are, very real humanitarian situations where people are coming to us and saying, admit me as a refugee. The challenge comes in the fact that our law, which is, by the way, the same law because it's treaty-based as England and Australia and France and many other the countries that participate in the Refugee Convention, really talks in terms of persecution or fear of persecution based on religion, race, national origin, political opinion, or social group. Now, social group can be a very elastic term, and that's how many of these new scenarios end up fitting in. But it is the issue that you're talking about is a particular challenge in Central America, where you have people who are, kids are really, really in danger there. The stories that I have heard from families in Central America are absolutely devastating, but very often they don't meet the clear legal definition of what it means to be a refugee. What we have done, at least for certain categories of young people in Central America, is created a category of something called parole, which is a different category of humanitarian admission to the United States. It doesn't have all the same benefits as refugee status, but basically allows children and certain family members of those children to say that I reasonably fear danger to my life and well-being. It doesn't necessarily make me a refugee, but I still have that reasonable fear. Admit me under this category. And so we've actually admitted, of the people that we've brought in from Central America, roughly 2/3 are coming in under this parole category. Because in fact, we recognize the fact that there is great danger to these people that doesn't necessarily fit the traditional refugee categories. That's a policy discussion that I think we're going to keep having for a long time to come.
Hey, can you say a little more about how that parole category works? I mean, how long can people stay? Is it adjudicated at
There's
some
the
point?
rub. I think what we do is we admit them for an initial period of 2 years. It's completely discretionary, which means that it is dependent on the policy posture of this administration, of my leadership, being something that is carried forward into the future. That's not necessarily guaranteed. But I believe we're doing the paroles, I think they're for periods of 2 years that then need to be renewed once the person is here in the U.S.
And just a quick follow-up is, like, what steps can we take to actually talk about modernizing this definition of as a refugee and what gets to be accepted as that? That is not undermining the
Yeah.
people that are refugees from Syria or anywhere else.
Right.
I think that's a very outdated conception of what it is, what refugee is, especially considering intervention that's been happening by this community in countries that are
Well, I'll tell you, a lot of what I know about political mobilization I learned on this campus. I mean, this is all about, you know, this is really about political mobilization and communities of interest pushing this issue. I think is I think the only way that there's going to be an actual shift in the legal definitions.
And would that take legislation, or could it be done administratively in some form?
I mean, I think we're doing what we can do with our administrative authorities, but you know, the law does limit us, as it has with the deferred action programs. The law does ultimately limit our policy options. But yeah, there is a certain amount that we have tried to do administratively. I imagine there's more we could do. Yeah.
You mentioned a little bit about the 11 million undocumented immigrants. Would you say that there are currently avenues for them to achieve some form of legal status?
It's interesting. I've heard the following. I think it came from the Pew Research Center, that 10% of people who applied for DACA, in the process of applying for DACA, discovered that they actually had a more durable legal path to immigration. You know, to achieving a more permanent immigration status in the United States. So very often there are people who, you know, they think they're undocumented, but actually they actually have a path toward a more normal status. That doesn't apply to everybody. So that means that, you know, I don't think we're going to be able to cheat our way out of this issue. I think we're going to have to find a real solution to it in the end, because I think there's a minority of people who are in that situation. Yeah.
Just a quick question. In terms of, you mentioned the issue of integration, how important it is for us to focus on integrating immigrants, you know, not just including, right? And so I was wondering if there are any initiatives or plans in place, or plans to tackle that issue of integration sort of from an institutional perspective, meaning, you know, a department that is part of USCIS that focuses on that sort of cultural aspect rather than just issuing grants or having it sort of sorts in that sense.
No, and mostly because we don't really have the funding mechanism. We have a limited funding mechanism for the grant work that we do. We have a relatively small Office of Citizenship. What we do, and we actually, I think, do it pretty effectively, is we leverage our public affairs and community outreach resources pretty well to support that work. But it is the model right now, given what our funding structure is really in partnership with, in particular, my great hope for the future on this is really local governments that you know, sort of really motivated in these areas, and us working with them to support them in the integration work. So I think right now there isn't, to your point of a more sort of institutionalized, federally based approach to this. There really isn't a movement toward that sort of model.
It would be a wonderful, I mean, it would be a great sort of, it would shift the perspective or sort of the notion that, you know, a lot of immigrants have of USCIS still being sort of an enforcement.
I mean, I think what we were seeking to do in the President's directing the formation of the Task Force for New Americans and the blueprint that we ultimately developed was really to marshal the existing federal resources, which pretty much any federal department you can think of plays a role, and to really marshal and integrate those, and then pull in the local and state partners. And that was the mechanism that we chose to achieve those goals. Yep, and then.
As the number is going to increase in terms of the number of refugees, I think you said 25,000 more than the 85,000. Are you thinking of different strategies for placing them around the country?
Yeah, I know we are. That's handled mostly by the State Department and the Department of Health and Human Services Office of Refugee Resettlement, so they bear the primary responsibility, and I know that they are thinking of that. I think one of the things that I think, especially depending on what the states end up doing, there is a different option. There's a name for it. I'm not going to remember it, but the basic idea is to deal directly with the NGO community instead of dealing through the states. So that's something that I think will play a part in the future in how we achieve these goals of resettling people. I think we have 2 here and then 1 up there. Oh, wow, lots everywhere. He's been raising his hands for a while.
My name is Jonathan. I'm an international student. So I'm wondering, to what extent do you think the programs working with undocumented immigrants and refugees affect other immigration programs like marriage-based, family-based, or employment-based immigration, and would it affect the quota or the manpower and money that dealing with?
I think the main thing it affects is the price, because as I mentioned before, those programs, some part of that revenue is used for the refugee, asylum, and for the subsidized lines of business. They are distinct operating units that process the family-based and employment-based petitions from the ones that do the refugee and asylum work. And yeah, and then the guy behind you.
Question about DACA. So the application process, is it cyclical? So in other words, if a person started the process now and we're in a political potential change, what does that mean for the person who's applying? So my understanding is that if it's approved, they have DACA status for 2 years. Mm-hmm. But if it's changed at the congressional level, I don't even know what the language is, what happens to that person who just recently applied?
So it is a discretionary program, and it's based on discretionary authorities, which means that while we authorize it for 2 years, it is at least technically possible that it could be, essentially terminated at any time. We don't believe that under any political outcome that's actually what's going to happen, because there's devastating consequences to doing it, not only to those individuals, but to the communities in which they live, work, raise families, et cetera. But the bottom line is, from a purely legal perspective, those are discretionary programs that theoretically they can be changed, including theoretically they could be expanded.
That gets right to my question, and I want to thank you. This has been fascinating. But you've talked about a number of these discretionary categories, DACA and parole in Central America. They're not unique, obviously. In the absence of comprehensive immigration reform, it feels like there's been a proliferation of discretionary programs, temporary protected status being another one. And it seems to me that these often start out kind of ad hoc in country A, but once they're created in country A, there's nothing to prevent country B from lobbying for them or something like that. And I'm wondering if you see any commonalities, either over time or across programs, in terms of who pushes to get these access to these discretionary programs, and then how the decisions are made as to which countries do get access to them, and which countries are turned down, and why.
The temporary protected status, I would kind of peel that off a little bit, because there is a statutory basis. That is a statutorily created program. So, many of these categories we have, statutorily afforded discretion, and that's what we do in temporary protected status. One thing to emphasize is that while most temporary protected status grants are based on the request of that country, it is not always necessarily the case. So, for example, I can tell you that Syria did not ask us to give temporary protected status to Syrians in the U.S. We did that, because that was the right thing to do. I'm not sure I could. I think we try to be principled and systematic both in adjudicating TPS and these other discretionary functions that we exercise, so that it is not dependent on what country you came from or the political path in which a particular thing might have been requested. In fact, one of the things that I think is really, our secretary was asking us, what thing do you want, when you hand the agency off, if that's what ends up happening, regardless of the outcome, that's something that could happen to me. And what are the things that you want the next administration to know? And I said, well, they need to know that I have a very highly professional and politics-free workforce. And that's something that I and every other director before and after me needs to fundamentally respect that, and have a principled, law-based way of doing the work that we do.
a couple of more questions. I wanted to ask you about H-1B visas to the U.S. And it seems like business would have an unlimited appetite for H-1B visas. And how do you think about what an appropriate level of those kinds of visas are? And I came here from the West Coast, from the Bay Area, and the concern there is that high tech will just import people from other places and not try to build our own strength of people who are already here to have those good jobs.
I think there is a couple of fundamental principles that drive either the basic design of those visa categories or the way in which they're operated that I think needs to guide whatever the ultimate policy landing. Because H-1B is definitely one of those where we think that the existing platform is obsolete. And it doesn't really meet the needs of the economy. But you really want to accomplish two things. You want to, on the one hand, support what the economy needs, and it very often needs right now, not 5-10 years from now. But two, you don't want to do it in a way that either displaces large numbers of U.S.-based workers, either because there is wage discrimination or because it somehow stops us from making the kinds of investments we need to make here to have the kind of workforce that we need for those industries. I think nobody thinks that the way it's set up right now is really giving us the work. I'm sorry, no, there are some who would argue otherwise, but that right now most people would actually argue there's actually pretty broad cross-partisan consensus on this point, that right now the way this is designed is really not meeting the full needs of at least some of our industries, that it's too restrictive.
And so we have students here who have learned about, you learned about advocacy here. And
I did.
It seems there are areas of dissatisfaction with the way our integration of immigrants and the processing of visas, et cetera, or the efforts to become citizens. So I just want to ask you, from your position, what have you seen? How do effective advocates operate? When they're effective and they make your agency move, what have they done that has really led your agency to move? Do they work through Congress? Do they go directly to your agency? What is an effective advocacy strategy that you've experienced as a head of this office? What does it look like?
I mean, one, I think there needs to be basic reasonableness to the advocated item. And so part of it is what is the outcome that you're looking for, defining that outcome, and then developing a strategy to define that outcome. There are a lot of different levers for pursuing that outcome. So it's all of the above, actually. It's grassroots mobilization, getting more and more people, and finding who the sort of the unlikely partners. That's one of the reasons I love this idea of Bibles, Badges, and Business, because they take communities that don't necessarily coalesce on much of anything else, but on at least on immigration, they actually do coalesce. And so building the kind of grassroots coalition, and then finding every way to amplify the voice of that, which is a combination of media strategies, legislative advocacy in the executive branch, understanding who's actually in charge, and who actually is, where are the right points of influence. So it's not necessarily enough just to write to your congressman or woman. It's a matter of how do you really kind of like get their attention, get them noticing. That's one of the reasons why I've always believed that a lot of the civic integration work that we do, the real purpose of it is not national elections at all, even though that's something people love to say about it. It's really all about local elections. And the reason is that it is so easy, and I've certainly learned this as a local official, to push the levers of power at the local level. Because a single vote counts for a whole lot at the local level. And noisy advocacy really counts for a lot. And so, very often that may need to be the first point of advocacy. Steve.
Another Christmas morning question.
I love those.
And a question about benchmarking, perhaps, as well. If you were able to wake up Christmas morning and head an immigration service in a country of your choice, not the United States, which would it be?
Oh, wow.
And how do you get your data? Do you relate to each other across national lines? Are there conferences? Are there opportunities
Yeah.
to benchmark best practices?
Yeah, actually, one of one of those cool, like, look at me now kind of moments. You know, I'm a kid from the neighborhood in Miami. One of the amazing look at me now moments from this job was being at a meeting of the migration ministers of the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. I'm sitting at this massive, massive square table with leaders, you know, my counterparts in 40 other countries. And one of the fascinating things that I learned, first of all, that I prefer to be me than them in most cases, but also that we, for example, when we talk about labor, we're all competing with each other. And so, you know, we are all trying to design the policy platform to attract high-skilled labor. So, you know, we're not only sort of competing with ourselves internally, we are absolutely competing with the Portuguese and the Spanish and lots of other countries that are really trying to the Canadians who are trying to develop progressive labor immigration policies that, you know, meet their needs. I don't know that I would see, different ones of them then do different things well. So I don't know that I'd be able to pick. That's a really interesting question that I will think about for days, but I'm not sure that I can pick one right now. Yeah.
Many of us are students and faculty interested in engaging with research on immigrants. I personally have volunteered with the Refugee Resettlement Organization in Providence, and I know that within certain ROLAGs, they collect data on immigrant integration outcomes, particularly, you know, surrounding refugees after these 8 months and other benchmarks. I'm wondering, you know, for those of us interested in potentially exploiting data available to the public, do ROLAGs, you know, send their data to you, or is there any kind of, you know, administrative record of particular outcomes for refugees or even other immigrants that you collect or send to you?
Not that we get. I mean, I think it would be interesting for you to talk to the Office of Refugee Resettlement at HHS, which I can happily help you connect with them. They may get that kind of data. One of the interesting things I learned talking to our Canadian counterparts is there is a lot that they do on that front that is way ahead of the kind of stuff that we do in terms of really gathering data about outcomes, et cetera, for refugees. Yeah, and then I'll go back.
There's a certain kind of conservative rhetoric out there right now about the idea of a total ban on immigrants who identify as Islamic or Muslim. And can you just talk a little bit about, like, the difficulties and also the issues with talking about immigration in terms of religion, and also even if that would be a viability if a certain candidate was elected and wanted that possibility?
The difficulties, I think your question is, would we be able to administer that if, God forbid, that were ever actually to happen? I think I'm allowed to say that. I can't even imagine how we would administer that kind of rule. I mean, I think I cannot tell you how wrong-headed and offensive and horrible I think that kind of position is. For among other things, you know, if you spend just a little bit of time among refugee communities, what is just stunning about them is how incredibly normal they all are, and how recognizable. You know, you'll meet a family, and there's a dad, and there's a mom, and there's 5 kids, and dad was a butcher, or a baker, or a teacher, or something in their country. And so a lot of the demonization that underlies that kind of policy objective is just like, is so not based on reality. I don't know that I would even know how to talk about how we would do something like that. And I imagine a lot of I don't even know if my folks would do it, actually.
A follow-up to that. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about some of the outdatedness that I perceive on the forms that are submitted to USCIS. So, for example, like the questions about if you exercise polygamy, like, and
yeah.
You know, if you had any association with the Nazi government of Germany, or certain, you know, espionage, like these questions that, for some extent, like for petitions of unaccompanied child murderers, sometimes they just seem kind of out, like not pertinent.
Yeah, actually, I think even now, every once in a while we might actually get a Nazi in the net. It's not, it's much, obviously it's close to gone, but it wasn't that long ago that there were actually Nazis still trying to seek admission to the U.S. Some of these questions are based in the law, I suspect, that creates categories that may actually be obsolete categories at this point. And it's interesting because there are questions, I think, that we need to be asking more sharply, that we're also constantly on the lookout. So, for example, in an environment where so much of the activity that we're afraid of is no longer state-based, but is more sort of group-based, that's something we constantly have to be thinking about. Is not only are we not asking the obsolete questions, but are we asking the questions we're really trying to find the answer to? Because one of the things that matters is, I think it will be the rare case where we say, are you a member of Al-Qaeda? And they're like, yes, I'm a member of Al-Qaeda. More likely it'll be a situation where they've lied to us. We ultimately determine that they've lied to us. We can prove it, and then we're able to take action against that person, is more the case. So, we're constantly on the lookout for those to update our forms. That's actually a big part of what, from a policy perspective, we're doing all the time. Yeah.
I was wondering if you could clarify your role on deportations. I know that USCIS, when it denies applications, or for example, someone misses an interview for immigration, there's a removal notice. I also know that there's kind of a collaboration for enforcement power with the Department of Homeland Security and ICE, and the Department of Justice at the same time. So I was wondering if this kind of spread of responsibility leads to a decrease in accountability.
Yeah, we'll issue something called the notice to appear in certain circumstances where we discover certain kinds of immigration violations, and that then essentially kicks the case over to ICE for them to take whatever action they deem appropriate. It is the fact, at least the way it's supposed to work, is either you are in order to be removed, you either need to be in a category that statutorily requires us to remove you, or it needs to be within the removal priorities that the Secretary and President have defined. But that's one clear way in which, to your question, we're certainly part of a continuum that could result ultimately in somebody's removal. The other, it is a reality that we sit on top of all of the immigration records actually going back a long time. And so, there are times when ICE will ask us, we're doing an investigation on this particular individual. We need their file, and our policy is that we give them that case. We do not give without reason sort of large volume. So that with DACA, that was a big area of concern. Would we just then copy it over to ICE? That's not what we do. Yeah.
I have a question about training staff. My understanding is the USCIS is about 19,000 people. And my question is along the lines of race and racism. So that's been a long-standing issue and conversation that we don't have enough in the U.S. So we think about neo-racism, particularly after 9/11. How do you make sure your staff is culturally sensitive to really understand various refugee populations? And
no, that's part of the, not only it's part of the training curriculum, cultural awareness. Especially for example, if you're a refugee officer and you're working abroad with populations that are very, very different in many respects from sort of social norms, et cetera, from here in the United States. That's part of the training. And also, dealing with children, dealing with victims of trauma, which is, in many different things that we do. That's part of what goes on. So that is part of the training. That is part of the training regimen for folks. That,
a pathway to have a diverse staff? So not only the training, but
we do. I will tell you that our in terms of sort of what they call comparison to the civilian labor force, we do pretty well at most levels. I would say that at our most senior leadership levels, we have an ongoing challenge. So that's something actually that we focused on is looking at our sort of career advancement, our recruiting, to work at that level. But on the whole, it's actually, as federal agencies go, it's actually and I have points of comparison. It's actually an agency that's done quite well in diversity. Yeah.
On the topic of training, who conducts your training? Like, how often are you trained, and like, how often is it kind of re-evaluated to see if it's currently applicable?
Yeah, it's constantly reevaluating because the nuts and bolts of what we do is constantly changing. So you're talking about forms. The forms are constantly changing. The regulations are constantly changing. The populations we deal with are constantly evolving. So from that perspective, it's always changing. Much of our training is conducted by more senior officers or even retired officers who come back as instructors. But we also get a lot of support from the NGO community, from all kinds of outside sources in delivering our training as well. Yeah.
Refugee sponsorship. As you know, like Canadian government has this program where families can sponsor like a refugee family. Like, would the U.S. government have some plans, something where like families can sponsor in the future or not?
We have with the refugee in the refugee categories, we have a few kind of compared to the Canadians, kind of limited pathways for family-sponsored immigration. It's basically somebody who already has a more traditional family petition, and this gives you a way to kind of move further in the refugee processing continuum. It's nothing near as robust as what the Canadians have done in that area.
One last time.
Yeah.
So what has been, you've talked about how we need to find, the solution, but like, what are the conversations that are happening? I assume you also sit on tables where, you talk about like what can be done. Like after the Supreme Court decision against DAPA, the Deferred Action for Parents of Americans, what is the next step?
I mean, I think what everybody, and I used to say this, by the way, even at the time that we were fighting the case with DACA-DAPA, even at the time that we were standing DACA-DAPA, because the thing to remember about those is that even those would have been temporary solutions. That in the end, existing DACA, the DAPA and DACA expansion, even though they would have in the short term helped a lot of people, really changed their lives. The fact is that this is that would not make the actual challenge go away. Bottom line, and this has been the position of this administration throughout, is the only solution is comprehensive immigration reform with a path to citizenship. So I'm not disclosing confidential conversations when I tell you that has been our position throughout, is that is the necessary solution.
But past those 4 words, is there anything that you can speak about?
Meaning things sort of in design right now?
I mean, in the ways of like, what are the standards that you'd like to see going into comprehensive immigration reform? What are, conversations about like what are the priorities? When it was proposed in 2010 by, congressional advocates, there was a huge emphasis on increasing deportation, on increasing the security along the border. There were these standards that, were being placed on reform, and so what are are those standards still holding?
So I think you've noticed that I am a little bit careful when I go into political territory. So I think, again, I can say from the perspective of what we would do, what USCIS would do, the key thing is the idea of a path to citizenship. To your point about increasing removal, it has always been the general political sense that in order to really achieve the kind of comprehensive immigration reform along the lines of what George Bush put forward back in the 2000s, what the president was trying to do more recently, that you need to also talk about enforcement. And that you need to have a, what is seen as a solid approach to enforcement. So I'm just describing the politics. I will not give you my opinion on that topic, but I am describing the basic political reality.
On that note of the basic political reality, I want to thank Director Rodriguez, a fascinating time, and thank all the audience for your great questions. So,
Thank you. Thank you.